Hey guys, Matt Goodwin. Well, one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy, and I'm sure it drives you crazy too, is the misinformation trick in politics, whereby members of our ruling class accuse people like you of misinformation while concealing information from voters. Now, we see this all the time when it comes to debates about immigration, multiculturalism and crime. Elites will say, well, you're misinformed for suggesting that things like migration might drive crime, while simultaneously hiding the data that they have on crime rates by nationality and immigration status. And nowhere is this misinformation trick more visible than when it comes to the atrocities that were committed in Southport. Now, I've talked before on this channel and in our Substack at mattgoodwin.org about how the Southport atrocities, for many people, became a symbol of mass immigration, our broken borders, and radical violent Islamism. Now, when I suggested this in the aftermath of those atrocities, many people out there in the elite class roundly criticized me and attacked me for inflaming tensions and for making irresponsible arguments. But this week, at the end of October 2024, we learned new information about the accused murderer, Axel Ruda-Cabana. We learned that he was trying to prepare, or indeed did prepare, biological weapons in the form of ricin, and we also learned that he downloaded an Al-Qaeda manual, a guide to committing terrorist atrocities here in the UK. Now, I did suggest at the time that this case was likely to be linked with these wider debates over migration and Islam, and here's what some people said to me at the time, beginning with none other than Mehdi Hasan from Al Jazeera. Check this out.
And yet you wrote about the guy accused of murdering these three little girls, that he was the son of immigrants from Rwanda. Why is it relevant that the suspect is the British son of Rwandan immigrants?
He ultimately was a product of migration. He was a second-generation migrant. We know from a lot of research that cultural practices, traditions, values, different ways of life tend to pass down from first to second, third generation. We know he came from a very conflict-ridden society, Rwanda.
We have no idea what his motivation is. The police don't know. What do you know that they know?
Well, one of those potential motivations, let's see what happens.
But why didn't you wait to see what happens before you made a kind of slur against Rwandan immigrants?
Because the fact is, this ultimately was a symbol, I think.
How is it a symbol? It's got nothing to do with his parents, unless you have some evidence that the police don't have.
As I said in the original piece, for many Brits, what happened in the 12 days of that hot summer, we saw young British Muslim lads assaulting police officers in Manchester Airport. We saw young second-generation lad stabbing a British Army officer almost to death.
What's that got to do with your description
because
of the...
just hear me out. In the course of a week, we saw the Southend machete gangs, mass violence. We had the riots in Leeds. We had evidence of communalism in other parts of the country. We had sectarianism at the general election just a month before.
In your opinion?
With independent...
Facts. This is your opinion?
Well, for lots of Brits, when you put that together and you look at the course of those things, I think what 2024 will come back to be seen as was really a watershed moment in our debate. Now, what I was saying in that debate with Mehdi Hasan was that for millions of people in the country, what happened in Southport was very obviously, I think, and I think many other people think, a symbol of what is happening in our country around mass immigration, broken borders, and their concerns over the rise of things like radical, violent Islamism. It wasn't just an isolated case, but it happened alongside a number of other cases in that summer that really underscored some of the challenges that come through migration. Now, Mehdi Hasan argues that this didn't really have anything to do with it. So did Nick Robinson, who I'll come to in a minute, at the BBC. But actually, if you look at crime rates across European countries and the link with immigration, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that actually some crimes are disproportionately more likely to be committed by people from outside of those countries. That's especially true, by the way, of Islamist terrorist atrocities. We've got research in the UK which shows more than half of the people who have been drawn into Islamist criminality came from outside of Britain. And so the revelation, the new information in October 2024 that actually this guy had downloaded Al-Qaeda information is actually very relevant to this case, and it's also relevant to the wider debate, because I think for many people in the elite class, you know, on the one hand, who rushed to describe previous acts of terrorism as far-right terrorism within only minutes of those attacks, now this time around suggesting that we should wait and be cautious and have delays and we shouldn't ask too many probing questions. Well, I think for many people in the country, they saw straight through that. Now, Mehdi and I had a very intense debate over this when we met at the Al Jazeera event, and I was trying to explain to Mehdi, against a very hostile audience, that actually if you look at the evidence in social science, it does suggest that many of the people who come into Western countries, particularly first generation, second generation, they are more prone to holding on to cultural habits, traits, characteristics and views that do sometimes leave some of them more vulnerable to criminality, more likely to commit crimes. And it appears that in some cases recently that is exactly what happened. But check out this debate now with Mehdi. Is Britain an integrated society, and do the people who are coming into Britain...
What evidence do you have? You seem to be implying all sorts of things
well, I think it's,
we know nothing about.
Well, I think going out and doing a mass stabbing and going on a murder
a mass stabbing is very British. Sorry to break it to you. A lot of British people do stabbings and killings. This kid was a Brit, is a Brit. Or is he not a Brit to you?
It depends how you define national identity.
Wow. So am I not a Brit?
No, I think it's, do you respect the country that you live in, and do you follow the rule of law?
So it's a conditional citizenship?
It's not conditional.
You just said it depends on whether you respect the country you live in. For somebody who doesn't want to judge people on group identities, why are you bringing up the parents of this kid? Do you have any evidence?
We have lots of evidence.
You do?
Social science has lots of evidence that the second, third generation migrants bring over certain cultural habits, traits, practices.
Murder.
No, but for example, second generation British Muslims, for example, will express higher levels of religiosity.
He wasn't Muslim. That's part of the problem.
No, but the underlying point...
No, because you're dodging the point here. This guy was the son of Rwandan immigrants, and you cannot explain to this audience why you thought it was relevant to bring that up.
I've just explained.
Because Muslims bring communal practices.
No, I've said I think it's obviously about immigration. He is a product of immigration.
That had nothing to do with it, as far as we know. We don't, but you're the one making the claim, not me.
I'm saying, in the context of that week, there are lots of questions to ask about to what extent was this guy integrated into wider society? Now, what you're seeing in these debates is a refusal among members of the elite class to entertain the notion that things like mass immigration, multiculturalism, the breakdown of our borders might actually be something we need to seriously address and deal with. Again, if you look at certain crimes that have been committed in the UK, for example, Islamist motivated criminality and atrocities, they are more likely to be committed by people from outside of the country, or first generation British Muslims who have carried over those traits, those religious beliefs, those characteristics from more segregated, clannish communities. I don't think that's a particularly controversial point to make, but in the world of the elite class, challenging these sacred values, challenging this religion of pro-immigration, of cosmopolitanism, is seen as being tantamount to far-right politics or Islamophobia. But actually, as we can now see, as we're learning, in the case of the accused murderer of those poor little girls in Southport, there does appear, at least on the surface, according to the reports that we've heard, and of course more information will come out as we head into the court case in January, that there is on some level a link here to Islamist literature, an Al-Qaeda manual, and an attempt to produce a biological weapon. And these were things that I was suggesting during these debates with Mehdi, Hasan and Nick Robinson, that if you look at the evidence, it does tend to point in this direction. And it also raises another question as to why millions of people in Britain were derided and denounced by Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper as far-right thugs or misinformed people, merely for drawing a link between these attacks and these issues over immigration, Islam and integration. And some of those people, of course, found themselves being sent to prison, a lot sooner, by the way, than those young Muslim lads who assaulted police officers at Manchester Airport. And that, in turn, fueled this widespread perception of a two-tier justice system. So this debate absolutely matters. Now, I also continued this discussion with Nick Robinson. I've got another clip to show you. Check this one out.
I want to go back, though, to the lie, because it was a lie about who allegedly killed those girls and children in Southport. You wrote a blog post in which you said, who murdered them? The son of immigrants from Rwanda. Now, of course, no one has faced trial yet, let alone been convicted of any murder. But it's almost as if you thought the distinction between the original lie and the son of an immigrant doesn't matter, but it matters hugely, doesn't it?
Well, as I said at the outset, I think what's happened this summer is we've had a string of events which lots of people will have seen as being all symbols of the breakdown of our social contract, which have all really hung on this question of, are we an integrated country? Are we an integrated society? Are we doing all we can to integrate newcomers into our shared community and ways of life? And whether it's looking at young British Muslim lads assaulting police officers, whether it's looking at children from minority backgrounds stabbing British Army officers almost to death, whether it's machete-wielding gangs in Southend.
Forgive me, you're doing it again. You did it in the original blog. There's a whole series of unconnected events.
Now, as I said to Nick in that discussion, look, for many people, clearly, this attack was about what's happening in the country, much like the riots and the communalism that we saw in places like Hare Hills, Leeds, the disturbances that we've seen in places like Leicester, the stabbing of the British Army officer, the machete-wielding gangs in places like Southend, elevated rates of crime among people from minority backgrounds. You know, all of this is stuff that British people want to talk about. Now, there's also a different conception of what it is to be British among the elite class, because as you've heard in these debates with Mehdi, Hasan and Nick Robinson, people in the elite class essentially think that somebody who arrived in the country only yesterday, who happens to speak a few words of our language, who might have a passport, well, they're just as English or they're just as British as people who have been on these islands for generations, who can trace their families back over generations, which is why in the aftermath of attacks like the one that we saw at Southport, you often hear things like, well, this guy was from Cardiff, this guy was British, and so on and so forth. But actually, what I would suggest is you're really talking about two different conceptions of Britishness, a much thinner conception of Britishness where the loyalty and the obligation, the responsibility, the linkage to that national community ultimately is weaker than an alternative conception of Englishness and Britishness where people genuinely feel a deep sense of obligation and community within that nation. And I think this is what these debates are really getting at. Ultimately, we need to find the truth. We need to pursue the truth. We need to find out what's really happened here. But I think for many people out there, what they're absolutely sick of, and the reason that I'm making these videos and writing on the Substack at mattgoodwin.org, is because they are tired. They are utterly sick and tired of, on the one hand, being branded misinformed or disinformed by an elite class that simultaneously refuses to give them the information that they need to make a proper assessment of what's happening in the country. Now, my job is to give you guys as much information as I can get my hands on, information that isn't always made available to people like you, and to spread it through our social media channels. So remember to hit like and subscribe. Join us at mattgoodwin.org. Help us share these arguments, the findings, the evidence, and let's keep pushing back against this elite class. Thank you for listening.